So, I mean, this is the final session, so we have the benefit of having listened to what everyone else has said, and it seems to me, we are accepting the need for speed, as it were. If we look at where we are on the path to net zero, we're nowhere near on track. We need to accelerate action, and we need to do that. We need to drive down cost. But the problem is that we're also in a world that's increasingly geopolitically fragmented, which is making things all the more difficult. And one of the themes today, it seems to be that the West, if you like, has been asleep at the wheel when it comes to building supply chains. We've had various explanations as to why this might be, that China has gained, some experts would say, at least a decade's lead, and it's going to be very difficult to close the gap. So what can be done? More specifically, what can the UK do now that it finds itself outside of the European Union? Between the European Union and the United States, it is an interesting position to be, particularly in a world that seems to be increasingly fragmented between China, Europe, and the US. Although I would say that one of my reflections on the discussions this morning is that they tended to be very Atlantic-centric. There's a whole world out there of emerging economies, which is the most dynamic element of the global system. And if you think about the fact that 90% of energy demand growth between now and 2050 is going to be outside of the OECD, and the majority of it's going to be in non-OECD Asia, we really need to be thinking in a much more global perspective, so that we need to understand that other parts of the world see the problems differently from the way that we see them. And I think that was alluded to when Bernice was talking about different attitudes of consumers in different parts of the world towards Chinese technology and Chinese consumer goods. So we have a period of time now for the panel to reflect on the issues. I've got a few questions to ask. One, framing the questions, I would say, and I think focusing on the UK, we should acknowledge that we have a new government, a new Labour government, and it's adopting a mission-driven approach to government. It has 5 missions, and the first 2 are highly relevant to our discussions today. That is kick-starting economic growth and making Britain a clean energy superpower. Now, you might not agree with the rhetoric, but at least there is the idea that we combine the two, that we have some sort of green industrial strategy that can deliver growth and decarbonisation at pace. So the first question that I posed without the question to the panel in my briefing note was, how can we reconcile the pressing need to accelerate climate action with concerns about energy security and geopolitical risk? Is industrial policy the answer? If you think it is the answer, then we'd like to know why. If you don't think it is the answer, then what is your solution? I'm not going to introduce the panel at great length. You've got their CVs, and perhaps they can say a few words by way of brief introduction before they respond to the first question. So Frank, first to you.
Me first, okay.
Yeah, we'll go this way to start with, and then we'll mix it up.
Yes, hello. So my name is Frank Ketelaars, working at DNV. I'm responsible for, within DNV, of actually developing our annual Energy Transition Outlook report we do for the UK and also globally. We've done it globally. Oh, is it on? Is it on? Yeah?
It's on now. When it's green, it's on.
Okay. I'm very much trying to have a view of using understanding of technology, cost of technology, rather than sort of trying to force the system to net zero. What we think will happen, based on what we know today, based on costs, based on current policies, where will the energy system go? So I think that's sort of where we're coming from, and trying to see then that use as a framework to discuss on how can we maybe improve things. Because, to be honest, that forecast we're showing is not very positive. It shows in a way that there is a lot, I would say, inertia in the energy in the incumbent energy system we've got today. A lot of things that, even though we talk a lot about sort of the challenges of the renewables, of course, the issues that we have still is an energy system that's very much dominated still by fossil fuels, and really expected, most forecasts probably agree that it will be dominating still for the next sort of 10, 15 years at least. So very much this, that how do we actually manage the two things? One, can we get across this inertia, making sure actually we get the energy transition to work faster than we need, than what we think will happen. And then secondly, actually how we can also then have a view on how we can incentivize other things to make things better. So when you asked me about how the question exactly when
is industrial policy the answer to acceleration?
I mean, I think because in a way we think part of it, yes. I think in the end we need to address some of the key issues around our because they will probably not happen if we just simply look at a market-led, a consumer-led type like changes. So in our view, yes, it is necessary. I think also in a way, being in a way, as you mentioned, sitting between the US and the EU, where I think there is quite a bit of these sort of policies are being initiated, the UK has to have a response to that. And I think in a way, it's probably not exactly clear yet where we are. I think we've made a good start here in the UK. I think so some of the things around the industrial policy, around the industrial cluster is actually working. There is a starting point, but I think we're not actually really seeing the real sort of investment happening yet. So I think in a way, yes, I would think it is necessary. I'm not so sure where the UK is going at the moment.
Well, Chris can provide us the answer.
Well, maybe. Yeah, so thank you, Mike. And also just to start, I'd like to thank Rusi for organising this event. I think it's really important right now, actually, and thank you for inviting me to take part in it. So I'm billed as Chris McDonald, Member of Parliament, but I've spent the last 25 years working in the steel industry. And if any of you know anything about the steel industry, it's a pretty sort of straight-talking kind of environment, particularly when you come off a night shift and everything's gone wrong. So I'm unlikely to make the best ever politician, that's for certain. However, I have picked up a job. I'm the Parliamentary Private Secretary to Ed Miliband, which means there is a danger that if I say the wrong thing, I'll commit the entire government to a brand new policy on energy. So watch out for that. But yes, is industrial policy the right thing? Well, I think it is, and I might just explain why. We're in the midst of a new industrial revolution, in case you hadn't noticed. It's a green industrial revolution and a digital revolution as well, both at the same time. And fundamentally, our industrial base, as we've seen in Ukraine, impacts on our capacity to wage war. Global supply chains have been disrupted considerably over the last few years. They're not as reliable as they were. I think, though, there is a big economic argument here. We neglect the heft of our manufacturing sector. It's only 20% of our economy, but it accounts for 50% of our exports. So if we want to be more prosperous, and we do need to be, to do all of the things that we in government want to do, invest in our public services, then we have to have more manufacturing to do that. There is no other choice. But also we've heard a bit about innovation as well, and manufacturing accounts for 70% of private sector investment in innovation too as well. That gap certainly won't be filled by services. So that's what it means at a national level. But if I think locally about the place that I represent, Stockton North, it's a place in Teesside in northeast England. It is a place that it has really suffered economically in the past. It's a very industrially intensive area, and as industries withdrawn, we've seen a high level of employment and deprivation. 1 in 3 children in my constituency grows up in poverty. That never used to be the case, actually. There used to be a lot of very well-paid jobs there. Manufacturing in the area pays £19,000 a year more than services. And whilst we talk about high productivity services, we talk about the sort of service economy that we'd see in financial services, those jobs are not coming to Stockton, but manufacturing jobs can. And Stockton, I think, when I'm talking about it here, is typical of many other places around the UK. The Resolution Foundation a couple of years ago did a report where they identified, it's called Stagnation Nation if you want to look it up, they identified that the UK is less prosperous and less equal as a society than all other advanced Western economies apart from the USA. And they put that down to the relatively small size of our manufacturing sector, ultimately to be able to spread wealth around the country. And there is a specific example of this, which I think draws a lot of these themes together. So this week I visited what used to be the ammonia plant in Billingham in my constituency. It operated continuously from 1918 to 2023, producing ammonia, produced 90% of the ammonia that we need in the UK. And you're probably not all chemists, sadly, but ammonia is essential for any country that wants to make explosives, and it's essential for any country that wants to make fertiliser. We literally cannot feed ourselves or defend ourselves without the Billingham ammonia plant, but it's closed, and it's closed due to high energy prices and taken away a number of very high quality jobs in the local area as well. That should be a source of concern for all of us. We've heard from Mike Blakeney, however, that Finland is the world's second biggest processor of lithium in the world, and I think, well, surely we can be as good as Finland. And in my own industry, steel, our steel industry in the UK is only the same size as the steel industry in Belgium, and Belgium is 1/6 of the population of the UK. And I think, well, surely we can be as good as Belgium as well, can't we? And so, I'm not talking about us taking on China, but I think we have got a problem if we can't even compete with other high-cost economies in Europe. So for me, the answer to this is industrial strategy, and I think we might come on to talk more about what that would mean in detail, what the policies would be. But I just want to say one thing about what I think our greatest challenge is in implementing industrial strategy. It's not our industrial capability or skills or innovation or investment. There's lots of that. It's also not market access. We've got a great market in the UK. I think our biggest challenge is a mindset challenge. We have in the UK imposed on ourselves a straitjacket of our own making, which is an idealised view about how world markets should operate. We now exist in a world where they do not operate in that way, and our failure to realise that and take action is the thing that is holding us back. My mission in Parliament and in government is to do something about that. That's pretty much why I entered politics, to try and help create a cross-party consensus around industrial strategy. And hopefully this afternoon we'll get on to talk a bit more about the details of how that could work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Michael Grubb, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at UCL, also Director of a newly launched Centre for Net Zero Market Design, because partly after some years we reached the conclusion that if we're going to have a net zero economy in the electricity sector, it's going to have to be organised very differently, and nobody knows completely how to design a market that would fit the needs of a net zero electricity system and economy. Just a couple of things on an industrial strategy. I was very interested that Ben made reference to managing risks and realising opportunities. We've been involved in research which says in the course of a transition of this scale, with the number of radical changes in technologies, structures, etc. going on, the idea that somebody can technically run a model and add up all of the costs and benefits and come out with your optimal answer is nonsense. You have to adopt a strategy of, we've got a lot of options, a lot of challenges, how do we maximise the opportunities whilst minimising the risks? It's not such an easy message in some ways for governments or analysts, but that's probably the reality. Clearly the risks include the geopolitical and other related risks, and it seems we're faced with a paradox, which is we need to decarbonise because of the growing geopolitical risk of climate change, as typically a false multiplier, and yet the solution seems to be a bunch of technologies which make us more dependent on critical minerals. That's absolutely true, but I think it is worth stressing, yes, but there is one qualitative difference, which is nearly all of the critical minerals we talk about become embodied in your capital. And so disruptions may make it harder to build new stuff, but they're not going to stop you getting energy from what you've built, which is, of course, rather different from the dependence upon oil and gas markets. So I think, when everybody says critical minerals, you have to bear that rather important difference in terms of at least the energy sector. Industrial strategy, I should have said, clearly, though, some diversification and also storage of both electricity and minerals is an element of that. Industrial strategy. Many people think of me as an economist, except possibly for the real economists. Economics has a history of great scepticism about industrial strategy, partly because it can point to governments getting it horribly wrong and getting trapped. Economics also tends to talk about the counterfactual. What would happen if we didn't do this? Well, what's the counterfactual here to an industrial strategy is, not having one, which means you're kind of expecting the market to drive one of the biggest transformations in over 100 years. And how do you do that? Well, you need an enormous carbon price and a firm belief in industry that they're going to get all the rewards of investing against that promise of some massive economic signal in the future, and industry will itself sort out all the supply chain, all of the network dependencies. It's nonsense. Of course you need an industrial strategy if you're going to have a change of this magnitude. And if we're so worried about the rise of China, one might notice that, that's kind of what China did. It said, okay, these sectors are going to be critical. How do we organise them? How do we deliver them? I'm not suggesting a return to central planning. I think in various ways aspects of that model does run into absolutely problems. I will just add two things on this. One is opportunities and risks. We think offshore wind is the backbone of future electricity, clean energy supplies. The reason we think that is because Ed Davey in 2013 took a massive risk which is associated with a huge opportunity. He promised £16 billion of underwriting for contracts that spurned the first generation of offshore wind investments at scale. Probably fair to say against the advice of most of the civil service, but he'd established that Siemens would invest in a big production factory in the UK if they took that step. So it was a risk and an opportunity, and it's probably one that's paid off. They won't all pay off, but some big steps have to be taken. I think finally the question then is, how do you manage industrial strategy sensibly? First of all, I agree with Chris. Throw out the ideology. Accept that markets are really important. There are things they do fantastically well, better than a government could ever do, and there are things where they have been consistently proven to be not really a good way of organising, for example, the railways, if you rely too much on simplistic ideas. So coordination, a vital government function. Markets cannot self-coordinate themselves across totally different sectors and non-existent markets to a large degree. Where you can, you, though, use incentives rather than direct government. So competitive auctions for offshore wind actually have been a very powerful mechanism to bring in competition. Effectively, it creates a new market, but it's one which is appropriate to something which costs a lot to build, has significant capital risk, and then very little to run. Finally, and where I think the biggest risks lie, is you do still need some semblance of an exit strategy. You need to know what's the landing point, and that is a combination of redesigning markets appropriate to the technologies and systems you're creating, and yes, getting to grips with a stronger carbon price in ways that don't drive industry abroad, partly by giving industry access to the fruits of the low carbon investments.
Okay, there's a lot there to think about. A few thoughts.
Yeah, I'll be fairly brief. I think points quite well covered so far. I mean, I think that it's pretty clear that there's been a market failure around minerals, and that's partly because of geopolitical factors, partly because of the climate factors that I was discussing earlier. To work effectively, the market really needs very high quality and consistent access to data. And at the moment, in the sort of period of deep uncertainty that we're moving into for several reasons, that data is simply not available. I think organisations like ours are working hard to fill the gap, but if you absent that traditional market mechanism, then you have to assume that some sort of industrial strategy is required, as mentioned, to coordinate the market and indeed to convene the key actors together so that they can come to agreements on the right ways to move forward. But I think that, sorry, it's not working, thanks. I think that we do need to think about how we can be smart with the industrial strategy and recognise that several governments, including in producer countries, are in pretty bad fiscal situations. And so that means having a real focus on understanding where the risk is and how government can play an effective de-risking role. And that's particularly clear, actually, in the international realm. When we're looking at mineral supply, the choke points are really upstream in mine expansion. And there is a very bad risk-reward profile for many explorers at the moment. This is one of the main reasons that majors don't actually go in to that part of the supply chain. It's one of the reasons that it's quite hard to get large-scale capital allocation to bringing new bankable projects online. And so we need to think about not just the industrial strategy at a domestic level, but how we coordinate with the industrial strategies of other countries. And we've seen kind of some semblance of that with the IRA and the attempts by the US to kind of coordinate onshoring. But I think that's quite far from what is needed, both domestically and internationally.
Okay, so we've had lots of interesting views, and unfortunately everyone's agreed we need an industrial strategy. So we're not going to have an argument among ourselves about the wisdom of industrial strategy. And I guess the next question then turns to, how to do it. I mean, for some it's much maligned. The idea that governments pick winners is that they often don't get it right. But as Michael's pointed out, there are elements of the UK story so far that have been really successful and have developed models that the rest of the world has adopted. I also think that if you look at the UK's energy transition pathway, certainly compared to our European neighbours, we're fast approaching challenges that they have yet to face. If you remember that by Christmas we won't have any coal left on the UK energy system, but at the same time we have a very ambitious target of a green power grid by 2030. So we've got an awful lot to get done. Already we have a large amount of intermittent renewables on the system, and gas is now primarily a source of backup, of flexibility. We also have a challenge around our aging nuclear fleet. So there's an awful lot on the inbox for Ed Miliband. But as I say, no shortage of ambition. So, given that there are probably far too many challenges to be addressed, I guess the question really is, where would you go first? And you're not starting with a blank canvas, remember, because previous governments had an awful lot of spent a lot of time writing strategies and 10-point plans. We did have competitions for industrial clusters. So we now, I think, have 4 formally recognized industrial clusters. So there is a degree of what we would call path dependency in terms of the energy landscape in the UK. Much of which has achieved a great deal, but what should be the priorities? What is the UK going to be good at? We can't be good at everything, but if we're looking to create competitive advantage, to actually turn this into an opportunity to not only keep but expand those high-paid jobs and opportunities in the UK market. So I know Frank is actually he's involved in DNV's global scenarios, but has also produced, I think, 2 already set forecasts for the UK energy system. So with that, the benefit of that background, where do you see the critical pinch points, the things that you would focus on?
Because I think it's always, once you actually have a clear pathway, I think things get, in a way, easier. I think, for example, the electrification of transport for car is, in the end, I know there's issues, lots of challenges, but it's quite clear what the end goal is. I think a very good example where it's not working in the UK is the whole issue on decarbonising our heating system. A lot of questions about it. We have a very, I would say, a system that's completely gas dependent today, of course. How do we change that? And I think at the moment, I still feel there's not any, and again, what our forecast shows in a way is that if we just do what we are doing today, it will be a very, very, very slow way to transform these 28 million homes, which have a gas boiler today. You have to replace it very quickly. And we are currently just relying, as we said, we're relying on markets, consumers' choice. Something as complex as that is probably not going to happen. So, for example, our forecast shows that in 2050 we'll still have about 60% of UK homes on natural gas. We're not going to a net zero scenario in our forecast, but so that's a challenge. So I think in some ways I can see where it's clear, in things like offshore wind, where we see the opportunity, where we have built a good footprint. Those things are happening quite well. It's where it's not so clear, I think that's where we need to make some decisions. And I think that's something, and the key thing as well, we have big ambitions, for example, on creating more renewable energy. The new Labour targets are even more aggressive as they were before. But the question is, that's the supply side. What are we doing on the demand side? Because there's no point putting all that stuff out there if we're not at the same time then making sure we get the whole population with us to actually also electrify the demand. So I think in a way I see issues maybe on the demand side a little bit in terms of actually matching sort of what we are trying to do on the supply side. And the other thing, I guess, is this sort of uncertainty, what we're seeing in the industrial space in terms of, again, a lot of talk about things about what's the role of hydrogen in the UK, but a lot of decisions are being pushed. The difficult decisions are still being pushed away. So I think a lot of this clarity on some of these decisions would really help an awful lot. And I think so I think pick the ones where we haven't got a clear choice yet. I think that making a choice is probably better maybe than just sitting on the fence for too long. That would be my view.
So there's a challenge there.
Yeah, there is. Well, I'm certainly not one for sitting on the fence. No. So look, you asked a couple of questions in there. Have we got a strategy already, maybe? What the priority should be? Well, look, I was musing this as I walked up Whitehall from Westminster Station earlier today. And if you did that journey, then like me, you'll have walked past the Ministry of Defence, and just on your right-hand side, as Parliament Street turns into Whitehall, is a statue of Lord Allenbrook. And it says on the bottom of the plinth, a man of strategy. He was indeed. Allenbrook could clearly tell the difference between stuff and strategy. And what we currently have in the UK is lots of stuff and not much strategy. There's a lot of tactics and not much strategy. And when we come to make these choices, what will our priorities be? I mean, to use a kind of another sort of analogy, it's not like we're in Waitrose browsing for which brand of Peruvian quinoa we want. We're shopping for meat and potatoes. It's the basics of life. So just to give you another example from my own constituency in Stockton North, during COVID, some of you may have heard of a town that's near me called Barnard Castle. It made the news for its ability to enable people to tell whether they were safe to drive or not. Well, Barnard Castle is just up the road from Stockton North, and it potentially could have played quite a different role in our COVID story, actually, because everybody knows that vaccines were developed in Oxford. They might not be aware that they were manufactured in Billingham, in the chemical works in my constituency. Now, they should have been bottled in Barnard Castle, but they weren't, because there was insufficient capacity there for glass vials. We have very little capacity to do that in the UK now. So the vaccine was sent abroad for bottling. Now, there's no point developing a vaccine or manufacturing a vaccine if you can't get the thing into people's arms. So if we can't make basics like glass, steel, cement in the UK, we actually can't really do anything else. And so in terms of what we do and where we develop a competitive advantage, well, I want to just make a bit of a shout out for commodities. They were mentioned on the previous panel. And I think we often believe in the UK we can't compete in commodities, but commodities are great. You make a lot of them, they employ a lot of people, you can make a lot of money from them. And people think they're low value, they're not. They're very high value, but they're low margin. And being a low margin good means you can develop a competitive advantage in the UK. So we make reinforced rebar, steel in the UK. We make about 70% of it for our domestic market. It is a commodity. It is the most commoditized steel in the world. And because of that, it's uneconomical to ship it here, because the shipping cost would ultimately destroy your profit margin. So I think we need to fall back in love with commodities, fall back in love with the stuff that enables us to live our daily lives. And also really move away from a very outdated and outmoded view of what a competitive or indeed a comparative advantage is for a nation such as Britain, because that sort of thinking ties us to stuff we've done in the past. It prevents us from innovating and thinking of what we might want to do in the future.
I think there's really interesting challenges in designing what exactly are the metrics and instruments of industrial strategy. Maybe let me build off first the remark. I think the traditional economic prescription has been least cost based upon market competition, and it says if you can get something more cheaply abroad, why force yourself to do something more expensive? And there are various answers, and entirely legitimate answers, but it's useful to be clear about when is it a real advantage to produce something at home. And I think there are some commodities for which that is really important, and there may be others for which the overall supply chain really makes sense. And I suspect, certainly a case for, I've had a couple of examples, steel, probably ammonia, there's a case there. Where I think there's, but it's not everything. It's like, there's loads of advantages to importing stuff from countries that do it better and more cheaply. Right? Let's be very clear about that. And the last thing the world needs is kind of more random trade wars against particular other countries, in my view. I think something that's not very often appreciated, though, is that you've got two very different strategies when you do decide you want to have something more at home, or something done more at home, or extracted or processed. One is some element of a subsidy or a state guarantee or whatever, which often would be designed to bring in foreign capital by underwriting some other risks, etc. And the other strategy is some form of tariff or local content requirement. And people often think, certainly economists say, no, they're both distortions to the market. Well, there's a rather big difference. A subsidy is something which the government's certainly not going to want to do too much of because it costs the Treasury, so there's a kind of a bit of a self-building constraint. And it makes the thing that you want more of cheaper. So green stuff makes it cheaper. The problem with local content requirements is they do the precise opposite. It says, well, we want to make this stuff at home, we want to make all of it at home, even if it's twice as expensive as getting it from abroad, i.e. we'll make the thing that we claim we want more of more expensive by forcing and potentially protecting high-cost domestic consumers. So I just think in terms of an industrial strategy, that's something else to be very aware of, the difference between local content requirement, which drives up the cost of the thing you claim to want more of, and subsidies which will help you accelerate your progress but have to some extent a self-limiting element to it and make the stuff cheaper. And I think that's quite an important distinction because we do see a spread of local content requirement in many countries, and that worries me.
And perhaps you can caveat your remarks by saying what would you like to see in the UK's industrial strategy around critical materials, which we've had a strategy, I think it was updated within 6 months of being published. So I'm not quite sure where we are now with the strategy.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Well, I mean, I think it's clear that the government is still determining its strategy on minerals. It's not alone in that space. That's a common situation across the Mineral Security Partnership. We're talking to several governments about how they develop their strategy in this space. Those problems with poor quality data are really pervasive and make a big difference there. I think the UK has several significant advantages that it can play to, whether that's domestically in sectors like offshore wind and indeed grid management, and to an extent in transmission and distribution infrastructure, things like cabling, which it can build out. But some of the greatest strengths that we have already been kind of name-checked by the previous panel. We have an extremely strong financial sector, lots of liquidity. We have lots of experience at managing metals markets. We still have some of the most important here, although that is eroding over time, partly because of a lack of strategy and support. We have some of the biggest and best performing mining companies in the world, particularly when we're thinking about some of the ESG standards. Groups like Anglo, despite having poor reputation in some areas, have really strong comparative advantages to some of the smaller miners in these areas. And then consultancy and research. You know, these are the kind of the vital connective tissue that supports everything, including industrial strategy, investment plans, expansion plans from key businesses. And we have a really, really strong sector in this country, which we already export very effectively, but where we don't actually apply many of those lessons domestically in the way that we should. So I think there's opportunity for leadership in areas like blended finance, supply chain management, as well as in rolling out some of these kind of sectors like offshore wind. I guess I would really caution on the emphasis that lots of industrial strategy is placing on batteries and electric vehicles. I think while those are clearly essential parts of the transition, they are only effective as carbon mitigation strategies if your grid is heavily decarbonised. Most of the carbon that comes from an electric vehicle isn't embedded in the battery, it's in the drive phase. And so we need to be really clear on how we're prioritising different sectors to deliver benefits not just for our economy, but for our wider society and our world. And that means concentrating on some of the stuff that's actually a lot less sexy than EVs, and it's things like transformers, you know, which are in extremely short supply.
Okay, so I think we've agreed we need an industrial strategy. We've got some idea of the things to focus on, the do's and don'ts. I mean, quite often, you know, obviously industrial strategy is not a replacement for the market, and part of what it's supposed to do is create conditions that leverage a much larger slice of private sector investment. You know, upwards of 70% of the investment for the low carbon transition in the UK is going to have to come from the private sector. And in that case, although we have obviously deep financial markets, we are a global financial centre in the UK, how do we convince international companies particularly that they should be investing in our transition? You know, so how can we make the UK an attractive place to invest is the next big challenge, you know, and if you've the benefit of a global perspective, perhaps. We'll start with you, Ben, at this end, because you seem to be last every time, so let's mix it up a bit. How can we convince companies, be it in the mining sector or wherever, that investing in the UK is a good bet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a significant challenge at the moment. When we talk to international companies and governments, of course, one of the things they raise first at the moment is Brexit and the impact that Brexit has had on the attractiveness of the UK as an investment site. And I think while it seems improbable that we'll suddenly rejoin the European market, I think that we do urgently need to take steps to remove some of those concerns from international companies and investors. I think one of the benefits of Brexit is that we should be much more nimble. So we should be able to produce these sorts of strategies, industrial strategies, subsidies, support systems, much more rapidly than competitors like the EU. We haven't really done that effectively to date. I think one other way that we can position ourselves that has come up a few times is to show how we can play a kind of bridging role between some of the kind of groups that are emerging, whether that's the EU and the US, or indeed starting to build some bridges with China, which is not, of course, a popular statement to be making, particularly in a kind of geopolitically focused place, but seems to be a really important role that the UK could be playing in this area.
Facilitating and coordinating could be a role, and we already see that in the various alliances around critical materials. So let's go to Michael and then work our way back here and to mix things up a bit. Making the UK an attractive place to invest.
I'll focus on the energy part of it.
Sure.
Because I think it is both sort of part of the solution and part of the problem. The problem, obviously, is the UK does have pretty high energy prices. It has for a long time. We ourselves, a few years ago, did research on why, and the answers are quite complicated, but clearly, an element of it, it's not just high prices from the way we distribute some of the charges, but also the sheer uncertainty. And the uncertainty comes because basically natural gas still drives the price at the moment, and we all know what's happening to natural gas. And anybody, as my former colleague, who's one of the world's leading experts on natural gas, Jonathan Cern, said, anybody who tells you what the natural gas price in a few years' time is going to be clearly does not understand the sector. There's far too many influences which make it impossible to predict. Currently, it looks overpriced compared with costs, as far as we know, but then that shows that people are nervous. And at the same time, we're trying to move towards a sector which has, basically very little dependence, if any, left on fossil fuels, where we know the cost of building the stuff, we should know the cost of capital, and it costs nothing to run. So we should actually know exactly what the price would be, and how come nobody can access that very easily as a major consumer? I think that is an entirely legitimate question that we need to get to grips with in market reform. I think the other thing that I'd say is it is also to do with the sheer consistency and confidence in the political messaging. So if you look at some of the technicalities of policy under the previous government in the area of some of the green energy transition, it wasn't that bad. But the problem is the messaging was all over the place, trying to appease parts of the party, and then you say, yes, well, we'll open, the North Sea to oil, and it's sort of like industry just didn't really know what to believe or whether the policy was stable or credible. And the more uncertain and unstable the policy looks, the higher your cost of capital. And if you take the cost of the energy transition as being very roughly 50 billion in grids plus a couple of 100 billion in the rest of the electricity system, believe me, the cost of the capital is almost everything. That will determine what the real cost of that system is over the next few decades. Strategically, a low-carbon electricity system is going to be cheaper because it doesn't cost very much to have the winds and sun. The question is all around the cost of the investment. And then in that sense, I actually think, the boldness of this current government is helpful. It says, we're going to do this. Every message is consistent. We're not going to sort of, fall back because people worry about some jobs lost in the oil industry. We're going to try and help a transition process and set up GB Energy in Aberdeen. But that is where the country is going. And don't let us think anyone believe that's going to be disrupted. That has an economic value. Of course it has some risk, but it has an economic value because investor confidence in the narrative is really important. Final thing, one does have to recognise, and it's astonishing people don't quite pin it down, ultimately, if the low-carbon transition is going to work globally, we have to find ways of making low-carbon investment more profitable than fossil fuel investment at scale and on a sustained basis. And I think that is not yet something that people have fully internalised for its implications across the whole energy sector.
Chris?
Okay, thank you. So I agree that, an industrial strategy needs to be about creating an environment in the UK that's investor friendly. That's my view. And I think it is also the view of the Secretary of State for Business as expressed in the House of Commons last week when he made a statement about steel as well. And I've sat around boardroom tables, both when I used to work in a corporate and then more latterly advising corporates, looking at investment proposals for steel in the UK, and we could never get the number in the bottom right-hand corner of the spreadsheet to give the rate of return that was necessary for the investment to go ahead. And we know the line items that cause that problem. We know the ones that we need to shift to make it work versus investing in another European country. And we can shift them. So it's about changing the policy environment to make the business environment work for investors. That ultimately, for me, is the success of an industrial strategy. And as I said before, it's about being as good as Belgium or as good as Finland. It's not hugely ambitious in that sense. But maybe if I can tease out a slight disagreement on the panel with Michael. So you made a comment, Michael, about local content driving up cost. And that's actually precisely the sort of assumption that I want to ask us to question, to think about really. And on the previous panel, Isabel made a comment about, are we prepared to walk away from the gains of the free market? Well, I think if you talk to my constituents in Billingham, or actually in Peterlee, which is close to where I grew up, I don't think they saw many gains from the free market. In fact, Peterlee used to have a very thriving garment industry until the late 1990s, an industry that mostly employed women in stable, high-paid jobs. And that industry was offshored. It vanished. Those jobs have gone. Those women now generally have much lower paid, less stable work in other sectors such as care or retail, if they can find jobs at all. And objectively, the quality of garments has reduced and the cost has increased over that period of time. So it's not just about buying something for a penny cheaper, it's also about looking at the total value in our economy as well. I just thought it would be interesting to tease out a slight point of difference if that was possible, because it's always quite nice. But I also thought I would agree with something that you said as well, Michael, which is about this consistency of politics. So in the steel industry, we have a saying that we invest for our children. In the mining industry, people tell me they invest for their grandchildren. And if you're going to get an investor to invest in the UK, they need a policy framework that runs beyond any government of any particular colour. It has to go beyond then. So again, part of my mission in the House of Commons is to find people who are interested in industrial strategy in all parties and talk to them, and I am doing that to try and build a bit of a cross-party consensus, because actually changing the policy environment is only one thing we need to do. We need to inspire investors with the confidence that this change is something that we will be with them for a generation at least.
Just maybe add one thing, because I agree, but the key thing is probably about having consistency and a long-term view, so you actually can sort of make your plans. But the other thing I would say, the UK has also, in the whole new energy space, a very strong, I would say, technology knowledge competence here in Europe, based on what we've done offshore in the oil and gas side of it, but also, of course, now in developing our wind industry. I think the potential of also our knowledge and I would say our competence around the whole potential on carbon capture. So I think there's also some very technology competence, and people mentioned as well the whole thing about sort of mining companies we've got here. So I do think there's something here that we can build on in terms of actually bringing some of that investment here. But I think it is tough. I think we are competing with some very strong other economies who are asking us for the same investment. But I think playing a bit on that technology is important.
I think there's a very strong message there. There was much discussion about geopolitical risk and companies having to manage geopolitical risk. But I was reading an article the other day about could companies actually insure against regulatory risk, in the sense that they build their business model and make their investment decision in a particular regulatory environment, and then the government changes the rules. And suddenly their business model's underwater. It is certainly true, whatever the industry, they don't have a problem with regulation per se, but it's the uncertainty of that regulation. The chopping and changing, that is the problem. So maybe the UK has the benefit of being outside the European Union, being not only nimble, yes, but not constantly flip-flopping and changing things, coming up with a policy that's rigorous and lasts the day. Now, I realise that time is passing, and I'd like to I could go on asking questions, but that's not particularly interesting. Opportunity for those in the room. You've been with us all day, hopefully most of you. So it's your chance to ask questions of the panel, or perhaps if you want to reflect on what you've heard today, that would also be useful. I know we've kind of moved around. We've been talking about critical materials a lot. We then delved into cyber security, cyber risk. And when we came back to critical materials, and this is a more general panel around issues of transition and competitiveness, but I think we've covered a lot of territory, so that hopefully there's a few observations in the room as well. So we've got a roving mic, so if you want to raise your hand if you have a question or observation.
Hi, Dan Marks from RUSI again. We have quite a few people on the panel involved in modelling, and my question basically is, what is the role of modelling in developing industrial strategy and in picking technologies and scale and where you put infrastructure and things like that? There are a lot of different models. They don't always agree. They're not always designed to be used for that purpose. So how can you use those kind of tools? And if you're not using them, how can you make decisions?
Frank, I'm sure DNV has models behind it.
Well, again, I know what you mentioned, the whole thing about sort of cost development is a key part of when we're looking at it. Obviously, technologies now are maybe not affordable, need the subsidies, but over time that changes, and at some stage they become self-sufficient. But the other thing I would say is especially in the energy system debate, so often I think people focus on one vector only. You get a lot of discussion now, just talk about hydrogen, talk about electricity. Again, we talk about decarbonizing electricity. But in the end, electricity is only today 20% of our use. So in the end, it's also decarbonizing the whole system. So one of the other good thing of models, I think, is showing these interrelations. So you can actually see, if you pull a lever here, this is what happens. I fully agree with you. Don't see it as the Bible, the truth, but it very much gives you a very good framework to discuss things. Like, if we want to do this, have you realized that this is linked to all these other energy vectors, and what can we do? So I think, especially in the energy system, to come up with a system where you are looking at supply, demand, all the energy vectors, and then how do you make it optimum for the UK? I mean, I think you need some sort of way of doing that. I think for something like the NISO, the new energy system operator, will be looking at things like that, I guess, to make sure that you come up with an optimum thing to look at. And the other thing I would say, it also allows you to maybe look at some of these things. For example, in the UK now, if we have a system in 15, 20 years' time, which is dominated by variable renewables, how does that system behave in terms of variability supply? The demand will be completely different, because we'll have suddenly all our heating sitting potentially on electricity. So you get changes on both those sides, and to really get an idea of what these potentially what stresses this would concern. I think it'd be very hard to do without a model, as long as you always are very clear what your assumptions are, and then be open to challenge. And I think what we found with what we've been doing on this modeling is actually the challenge is the really interesting bit, and different stakeholders give you different questions. And so I think that's why I've only been involved in this for the last 3-4 years, but I really found it very fascinating that a model actually gives you a lot of insights, and rather than the result. The result is probably just part of the headline, maybe.
I said I don't know much about models, but that's not strictly true, because one of the projects we've been doing at UKirk with colleagues at UCL actually is looking at how models do or do not account for geopolitical factors. And very few of them obviously do, because they're driving a more optimal system that's not going to take those things into account. However, if you look at the various scenarios out there, and many scenarios have got modelling behind them, geopolitics is nearly always seen as a negative factor that it makes things more expensive and slows down the pace of change, which seems to be the consensus view we've reached in this room without any models. But one of the other things we did discover, and Ben can perhaps speak to this, is the models are very poor when it comes to things like critical materials, simply because we don't have the information to put into the model then to drive the solutions going forward. So in your own work, you were talking about composite risk indexes and tying it into physical climate risk. Obviously we have very sophisticated climate models, and we have energy system models, and trying to think about that physical risk and how that physical risk factors into the costs and capabilities going forward is also, I think, a major challenge. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think it was George Box, who's a great statistician, who said that all models are wrong and some of them are useful. And I think that just about captures it. I think in the data world, there's this phrase, garbage in, garbage out. If you're feeding a model with bad data, then you're not going to get good outputs from it. So that's obviously an issue. I think there's this question of how do things interact and how can you model that effectively, particularly when some behavioral factors are particularly significant and obviously hard to capture. from a modeling perspective. I think that that's where I agree really strongly that scenarios are a really useful way of using a model as a kind of convening tool or a point of reference so that you can actually get the benefits of experience, expert insight, and judgment. I think one of the major problems that we have with any forward-looking model at the moment is there's no real process for verifying its outputs until they actually land. And so I think we do need to think about, where are the kind of crucial tipping points that make models quite hard to use effectively, and how can we recognize that, models will sometimes point to two quite diametrically different outcomes, and that we therefore need to plan on both of those, rather than take some kind of average or model agreement that, that actually presents a world that's actually quite unlikely as a kind of compromise between those two things. I think that the way that modeling is done is significantly enhancing, and I think the use of things like digital twins that can really provide a much more textured view of the way that some of this data interacts are useful, but I don't think there's any time soon going to be a substitute for expert insight and judgment. I mean, it's like you wouldn't use an AI alone to write your report. That's kind of the approach that you would be using if you were just using models to make decisions.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the really, really interesting discussion. So it's Steve Hermanson from National Gas, and my question is, given how delicate it feels this transition would be and all these models are to security threats, and we were talking about security earlier today, whether that's digital or physical, what role do you think the Strategic Defence Review ought to play in helping support the industrial strategies that we're all talking about here, because of that security flank which could come in from stage left or stage right and entirely undermine or unpick the best laid plans? Just wondering what the panel thinks about how you cope with those security externalities, and whether something like the Strategic Defence Review can support industrial strategies like this.
So a question around the Strategic Defence Review. I think we're quite lucky, and I know that the MOD will be publishing Global Strategic Trend 7 in the coming weeks as part of a backstop to the review. So that will give us a very thorough analysis, and I think they've got 6 scenarios for the future, so there's a lot to ponder in that. I'd also perhaps reflect on, in a kind of a counterfactual, and considering the impact of the war in Ukraine, and it's already been alluded to in terms of focusing minds around strategic challenges and need to have a military-industrial base in Europe, is that when we get to 2030 and reflect on where we are, hopefully with the Green Power Grid in the UK, but that aside, will we be wondering whether, in fact, out of a tragic situation and war in Europe, we've actually accelerated the energy transition to a greater extent than we would have otherwise have done, and that Europe more generally is in a much better place in moving into the 2030s to get on with the business of the low carbon transition. I'd like to hope that we would, but I do think we've already had suggestions. We had suggestions from Chris actually that there are real strategic concerns here, that we need to think about the world of geopolitical competition and securitization, that it's not just about decarbonisation here, it's about maintaining a military-industrial base, being globally competitive. And that's also a means of continuing to cooperate with our allies. The point was made actually, and I'm a student of the Soviet Union, and I worked on the Soviet Union in the 1980s, that the critical materials and critical minerals lists go back to the Cold War, because these same materials are critical to the military-industrial complex. And I think if you look at many of the reports on critical materials, not only do you get a diagram of an EV, you get a diagram of a battle tank that points out that many of the same materials are also important there. So I think to me, it's a sad situation we find ourselves in, but maybe some good will come out of it, of accelerating the transition. But I'm not sure what others feel about this issue. Then it doesn't need an answer from everyone, but I think Chris did allude to it, so perhaps.
Yeah, Happy to kick off. So I think it's a great question, particularly given the timing. So yes, in my view, the strategic defence review and the industrial strategy do need to go hand in hand. I think it's, in an ideal world, you'd probably have the strategic defence review first and treat that as an input to the industrial strategy, but actually it's an iterative process anyway. Our pretense to have a defence capability is entirely dependent on our industrial capability to deliver it, fundamentally. You need strength and depth in industry in order to prosecute a war. Your best defence against war is your opponent presuming or seeing quite clearly that you could actually prosecute a war. And of course, wars are fought in so many different ways now. I mean, we've been involved in a level of conflict with Russia for quite some time in many different ways. So this industrial capability, I think, runs beyond some of the heavy industry I've talked about into areas like cyber and so on. So yes, I think the two do link together, and I think it's vital. And I think also it comes back to a couple of points that were made earlier about the risks around industrial strategy provoking some sort of trade war or trade defensive measures from other nations. And I think it's difficult to separate that from defence. For me, that isn't really just a trade issue; it's also a defence issue, because you have to ask if the risk of me having an industrial strategy, the UK having an industrial strategy, is that another nation will respond. Well, that almost demonstrates how important that industrial strategy is, because that other nation, is prepared to expend, money and influence in trying to stop us from implementing it. So this, ultimately, this is all driven through the lens of geopolitical power, and the ability to prosecute war as well as to trade is all tied up in it. Sadly, this is a reflection of the times that we live in now.
Does anyone else want to comment on? Please, Ben.
So, I think obviously the terms transition minerals and critical minerals are kind of used interchangeably, and I think that underlines, as Mike was saying, that these materials are critical to defence and security. I think when we think about the arguments made about diversifying away from China, that's normally because people are concerned about active conflict or some sort of massive expansion of export controls from China in relation normally to some sort of security-related scenario, be it Taiwan or other. And so it's clear that defence and the strategic defence review is already a core part of the way that we're thinking about critical mineral supply chains, and should be a key consideration in the way that we think about resilience and strengthening them. That said, I think there are very, very substantial risks associated with securitizing critical minerals to the extent that we have, particularly in the US. We were on a call not long ago with a US group that's connected to the government. We mentioned that we also provide information to Chinese groups, and they immediately stopped the call and said that we had to go through a several-month due diligence process. And they're essentially saying, don't talk to the Chinese. And I think that kind of scenario where we don't have dialogue between different countries is very, very dangerous. And then you have this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy associated with critical minerals becoming one of the main points of friction between China and the rest of the world. So we have to be clear-eyed about the political realities here. There are very substantial geopolitical risks in these supply chains, but we need to be identifying ways to reduce those gaps and build cooperation rather than widen divisions in the way that we're approaching this.
So possibly just more of a comment than a question. Leslie Harding, I come from Liberty Mutual, so one of the world's largest insurers and investors, institutional investors. It's really a comment. We've talked a lot today about risk, and a lot of that risk is actually underwritten, particularly in the UK, in the City of London. And I guess this is really a comment to Chris. When we talk about industrial strategy, we often focus on industry and we forget to focus on the financial services sector as a key enabler to that industrial strategy. So I just wanted to put it out there, more collaboration between those two parts would be really, really helpful. We're there to enable the energy transition, we're there to take risk, we're there to model risk, and we're there to work as a convener of parties across industry and across the financial services sector as well. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you for mentioning that, and I'm sorry there hasn't really been an opportunity to talk much about that up to now, but this is very much something that I'm interested in. So I've been working for the last few years on trying to bring together my sort of colleagues in industry who want investment with the city particularly, where there is plenty of investment going. And I think one of the big challenges has been helping people in industry to understand what an investable proposition looks like from the other side of the table. So there is a bit of work to do with industry there. But I see the financial might of the UK as almost like a secret weapon we've not yet unleashed on industrial strategy. If we can create a good business environment for investment and help our industrialists to understand what an investable proposition looks like, we will have no problem bringing capital forward to do that. So there is a lot for industry to do. I think there is something that the financial institutions in the city can do as well, which is to kind of recognise that maybe people in industry do have some good propositions, but they can't speak your language so well. I was speaking at an event at Aviva in the city this week, and I will continue to do that to try and help bridge those two worlds. And if there is anyone in here from the financial sector who's interested in contributing more to industrial strategy or finding out more about it, let's have more discussions about that after this session. And thank you for asking that question. Thank you.
Okay, as that was a comment, not a question. Any final question in the room? It doesn't have to be, but yes, please. One last question, and then we will let you go. Unless it's a comment.
Hi, Dom Lorimer from Collinson Grant Management Consultants. But my background's working for one of the largest private recycling companies in the UK, running the factory for over 6 years. One of the key issues there was investment, and we're a private family-owned business, and trying to get investment, the hardest thing was sort of stability, and we've talked about it a lot here. How do we get a robust enough strategy to overcome any global changes, because it's a global issue, global market. So yeah, how do we make sure within the UK we have a robust enough strategy, really, to overcome any changes?
I have an answer, but we talked. The word resilience was used time and again. I mean, and in a sense, that's how a system reacts to a challenge and mitigates the risk, but it doesn't return back to where it was. It learns from the experience and moves on. So I don't think we need to be so sort of dogmatic that we're not flexible, but equally we want to have a system that is going to deliver a degree of certainty. Certainly, I think what most companies want out of the energy transition is a profitable transition, and that's the hardest thing to guarantee. And Michael talked about the problems of the rates of return in the low carbon sector versus the traditional rates of return in the fossil fuel sector. Maybe that's partly about educating shareholders that those returns simply aren't there, and they shouldn't have been there in the first place in fossil fuels because they weren't paying the externalities involved in the production and consumption of their products. But I don't know if everyone's got thoughts on building in that. In an uncertain world. I mean, the title of the conference is Being Competitive in an Uncertain Transition and Uncertain World. And what you're saying is you want a degree of certainty in an uncertain world. I mean, that's the one thing you can't have is business as usual, uncertainty. I don't know if any others have anything else to reflect on. Or maybe that's a good point to stop. But Chris, I'll give you the last
Well, I was just going to say, it picks up on the previous point, I think, really. There is sufficient capital out there. So I've been, in the position you're in, looking at similar sorts of projects, including investment in the business I used to run. And really what you need to do is, not you, what we need to do collectively, is help you to get the risk down and the profit up, ultimately. And there are the points I made about the industrial strategy changing the business environment will help with that, because that will give you some certainty that will get the risk down. And then some of the other things that we've talked about on the panel today that would help to get your profit up will be more industrial investment generally. So I'm not really sure what products you are recycling, but presumably you'll sit within a sort of supply circle of some description. So, having a projection of forward growth in your market would help with that, and more industrial investment generally would help with the supply chain. So those are the things I think would benefit. Yeah.
Okay, just one final remark. I spent last week in Shanghai teaching our MBA students on a course that we run called Managing Sustainable Energy Transitions, and it was co-taught with Chinese colleagues, and there was a very bizarre moment. Actually, it was my colleague from Warwick who played it, but we watched a music video on the 14th five-year plan, complete with a rap artist. And I was struck by one of the slogans that kept on booming along, and it said, "Made in China, China made it." And it was a reflection on the fact that, one of the reasons for success in China is getting on and doing it, and not necessarily having the perfect solution, but actually doing something and then perfecting it as you do it. And I think maybe we're guilty of wanting the perfect answer, and maybe what we need to do now is simply get on and do it, and start delivering with the technologies that we know that we have, and managing the risks that come with that. So hopefully on that positive note, we'll have made in Britain and Britain made it. Thank you very much.